What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Packers at 49ers. This is the second Sunday game, kicking off at, I believe, 6:40 Eastern. This game has a 45-point total, so about a touchdown lower than the Kansas City game. And the 49ers are also 7.5-point home favorites. It's shifted between 7 and 7.5, but it's at 7.5 right now. We'll start with the Packers side, always the visiting team first. And their game plan on offense is pretty simple. Get the ball to Davante Adams and Aaron Jones. Those two accounted for 30 of the Packers' 41 non-Aaron Rodgers touches last week. By that, I mean if you take out the Aaron Rodgers scrambles, you're only left with 11 touches that didn't involve Adams or Jones. Against many teams, that wouldn't be a problem, but it could be against the 49ers. They rank second in pass defense DVOA and third in yards per attempt allowed. I mentioned last week that the 49ers had given up a lot of production to close the season, but that was almost entirely related to injuries. They suffered so many injuries on the defensive side of the ball, but they got most of those back. And it really helped having that bye. We see last week, the Vikings come to town. They get 2.1 yards per carry on the ground and just 5.9 yards per attempt through the air. And that was actually down to 4.7 yards per attempt if you exclude the Diggs early touchdown. Just for reference, Trubisky had the league's worst yards per attempt in the league this season, and he was at 6.1. So they turned Kirk Cousins, who had the seventh highest yards per attempt, into a worse quarterback than Trubisky. That's pretty good. These teams did meet back in week 12, week 11, week 12. It was somewhere in that range. And that game got so out of hand that Tim Boyle replaced Rodgers to close out the game. Not only was it Rodgers' worst game of the season, but it was actually his worst game of his career in terms of yards per attempt. And yes, both Adams and Jones were healthy in that game. So if the Packers are going to win this one, then they need to figure out a way to beat this defense, which isn't something that teams have been able to do while they're healthy. They've been able to do it while they're banged up, but while the 49ers are healthy, no one's been able to really figure this team out. And it wasn't something that the Packers were able to do a few months ago. I think the most interesting matchup on this side of the ball will be Davante Adams. We know that Sherman will stick to his side of the field, and that the Packers, they're just going to throw some wide receiver they don't want to use on that side. They'll put Allison or MVS over there, and they'll just be like, listen, you're not getting the ball anyways, go occupy Sherman's side. The issue for the Packers is that even though Adams will mostly avoid Sherman, the 49ers know that, one, teams aren't going to throw over there, so they don't need a bunch of defenders, and two, Sherman's good enough to just be left on his own. So they can shift a lot of coverage to the other side of the field, and that really hurts Adams, right? Because we saw them do this the first time around, and he had just 43 yards on 12 targets. And you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. He's avoiding their best player. Because they're able to shift so many dudes over to the other side, it's really tough to get open. So if the Packers are going to move the ball better this time around, then they're going to need to figure out ways to get Adams open, even with the extra coverage. Because if they can't, then it's going to be really tough for them to keep up with the 49ers offense. So let's move over to that side of the ball. And we saw the flexibility of this offense in full effect last week. George Kittle had just 3 receptions for 16 yards, while Emmanuel Sanders had only 2 receptions for 33 yards. And while they didn't, move the ball to perfection or anything, they still scored 27 against a really good Vikings defense because they have so many different players who can contribute. Even taking away Sanders and Kittle, you're left with so many guys that they can still put up into the upper 20s to 30. That's especially true for their ground attack. Coleman, Mostert, Breida, they make for an incredibly efficient backfield. They're all really good, and it allows them to play the hot hand. We know that Mostert is kind of capped around that 11, 12, 13 range. That's what they want to give him. But basically between Coleman and Breida, listen, whoever's dominating that game, they're just going to keep in there and give their touches. So that allows them to be much more flexible in offense. The Vikings have one of the better defenses in the league, but even they couldn't figure out a way to stop everyone. They limited the passing attack pretty good, but then they got destroyed on the ground. And I would venture to say that if they had stopped the ground attack, then the passing attack would have excelled. Looking ahead to this week, the Packers do not have a bad defense by any means. They actually have an above average defense in a ton of different metrics, but every defense has its weakness. And for the Packers, it's giving up big plays. I want to credit Brett Coleman for making a really, really good video on what this defense does wrong. But in short, just to summarize that, you should watch the video, but just to summarize it, their play calling is very predictable, and they give up a ton of explosive plays because of that. When offenses diagnose exactly what their defense is, and apparently they can do that pretty easily, they're able to shift to plays that will destroy, and they're giving up a lot of big plays because of that. This weakness isn't made apparent every week because not every team is equipped to just throw the ball super far downfield. Think of a team like the Patriots. I mean, even if you can diagnose their defense, I mean, Edelman's not getting a bunch of 50-yard receptions, right? So not every team is equipped to take full advantage. But the 49ers are, and we saw it happen earlier this season. They very quickly diagnosed exactly what the defensive play calls were, took advantage, and they were successful because they have so many explosive players. Now, maybe the Packers will find a way to fix these issues, but they'll need to fix a lot to slow down the 49ers offense. And with Shanahan being one of the best coaches in the league, and with this team not being afraid to be very creative on offense, if they don't make those changes, then this one could get ugly. So what do I think ends up happening? Well, I do think the 49ers will be able to slow down Aaron Rodgers again. I do not think he's going to have the worst game of his career again. So they should come to this game much more prepared, and I expect them to get at least into the double digits this time around. I believe they only scored like 8 in the first game. However, I do not see them scoring into the upper 20s, which is likely what they'll need to stay with the 49ers. I think the 49ers have too many weapons and are too well coached to not score at least into that like 24 to 26 range. They've only been held below that mark 4 times all year, and I just can't see the Packers pulling a complete 180 on defense. I expect them to improve this time around for sure, but they'll need to make so many changes to just shut down the 49ers, and I don't see that happening. So I'm predicting a final score of 34-13 with the 49ers fulfilling my preseason prediction of NFC champions. So that'll do it for my breakdown of this game. You can see the breakdown of the Titans at Chiefs game also on this channel. That's the end of this one. I hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting the like button? If you're new here, how about subscribing to the channel? Thanks for watching.